Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Heut, triumphieret, Gott ist Sohn, which translates to Today the Son of God triumphs. Very interesting chorale. I mean, the chords are laid out fairly clearly in this chorale, but the sound and the progressions that we see are kind of unique, fairly unusual overall. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. It's deceptively long, but we're in 3/4 time, so the phrases tend to go by quicker than analysis in 4/4, even though they look somewhat longer on the page. But that being said, no key signature. We start on A minor. We end on E major. So we have a bit of a conflict here. I think we do start actually in the key of C major. But I think the overall tonality of this chorale, based on the ending, is E minor. So this chorale definitely has some macro tonal ambiguity in the sense that the ending sort of is sprung on us because it's the first and only time we see the key, and it really only happens at the very end. The phrase doesn't even start in the key of C major, or A minor for that matter. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis. Like I said, C major. We start with an A minor chord, which is 6, passing tone here in the alto before we get E, C, G, and C. Tonic triad, first inversion, 6 going to 1, 6. That'll be a progression we see later as well. And then we have G, B, G, and D, which is our 5 chord, G major. Our first cadence, while I'm at it, is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C. And our 5 chord resolves to 1, C, C, G, and E. Tonic triad, root position. A little passing 7th here in the tenor. We get D, A, F, and D, which is a 2 chord, D minor. And this is the first interesting progression. We have E, G, E, and C. A 2-to-1 progression. Pretty much no real salt to be added here. No grains of salt, no hidden sort of things that could be taking away from this progression. It's a plain old 2 chord going to a 1 chord. Typically, under these circumstances, we would expect to see a 7 chord in first inversion, so D and F accompanied with a B rather than an A. But here we see 1 going to 2, going to 1, 6, which is taking this pattern of traversing the 1 to 1, 6 and using a 2 chord rather than a 7 chord. And I feel like this is more of like a structural substitution based on my relationship with the harmony, in the sense that 2 and 1, they're mostly similar. They share a lot of the same pitch content, so they could be substitutes for one another in that regard, but we're definitely used to seeing 7/6 chords in this context rather than 2. And the really cool thing about this is that we are going to be seeing another 2-to-1 progression in a similar fashion in the not too distant future. So we're closing in on our cadence. We have 1/6 going to F, A, D, and C, which is D minor 7 over F. It's a 2-6-5 chord. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. That leads us to 5, G, G, D, and B, which is G major in root position. And then we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C, which is our tonic triad in root position, marking the end of our perfect authentic cadence. So in our next phrase, we end in the key of A minor. Fairly straightforward modulation as well. We see a G sharp here, so it's probably going to happen at the end of the first measure of the phrase. We start up with F, F, A, F, and C. It's our 4 chord, F major. And actually, a little interesting tidbit about this phrase, maybe you'll agree with me based on the way that it sounds. This really sounds like we're in the key of F here. It's its own separate idea when we go from F to C major to F again. It kind of feels like we're good. We have a 1-5-1 progression here in the key of F rather than a 4-1-4 progression in the key of C. But because we don't see any B flats anywhere, it's hard to make the argument but when we isolate this phrase alone, it sounds a lot more F major-like than it does C major. So maybe there is a modulation here, who knows, but it doesn't have anything that hints at it other than the fact that it starts the phrase with sounding that way. But I'm going to call this a 1/6 chord, E, G, G, and C, and then we go right back to F, F, A, F, and C. It's a 4 chord. A minor is, I think, the next key that's following this, like I said, with G sharp happening on the beat after. So in the key of A minor, it's now our 6 chord. And then we have B, G sharp, F, and D, which is G sharp fully diminished 7th over B. That would be a 7/6/5 chord. And that takes us to an A minor chord, C, A, E, and C. A minor in first inversion. We then have D, B, D, and B. Kind of an interesting spelling here. We don't know whether or not this is a B diminished chord or a B minor chord or a G sharp diminished chord, but I'm going to assume based on context that this is a 2/6 chord of some sort, B diminished over D, and it takes us to A minor, C, C, E, and A. 1/6 again. Here we have 2 going to 1. Another 2-to-1 progression here. I think the first occurrence of this progression is a bit more interesting because we've seen this pattern hundreds of times in Bach. 1, 7/6, 1/6, but here we're seeing 2 right out here in the open, nothing veiled about it, fairly straightforward. 2 is being used here. Here we have 1/6 going to 2/6, back to 1/6, and it sort of feels like almost like a complement of what's happening here, where Bach is prolonging the idea of the 1 chord, just like the same way that we have some sort of buffer separating 4 and 4 here. But what's interesting is Bach is using, in F major terms, a dominant here, and in A minor terms we're using a supertonic, which, to be fair, is a diminished chord, so it inherently has the potential to tonicize something, but not A minor. We have the potential to tonicize C major, but to that point we are in first inversion, and a first inversion A minor chord, especially the way that it's being spelled here, has C in the bass. So maybe there's some truth to that there. It's still a particularly unusual progression. Seeing 2 going to 1, at least in the way that I've analyzed the chorales, is rarer. So when the progression pops up, a red flag or a siren goes off in my brain to pay special attention to it. But we do see very similar phrase ending in the second phrase in comparison to the first phrase. So 1/6 takes us to D, B, F, and A, which is B minor 7 flat 5 over D, 2/6/5. Again, we saw 1, 2, 1/6, 2/6/5. In this case, we had 1/6, 2/6, 1/6, 2/6/5. So slight variation, but similar in terms of the output, largely similar at least. And we would expect this to go to 5, which it does. E, B, E, and G sharp, E major in root position, and then we cadence on A minor, A, C, E, and A. Tonic triad, root position. Moving on to the next phrase, which is another phrase that ends in the key of A minor, happens to end in a half cadence, which also happens to be a Phrygian half cadence. Not super important, but something that I'm tracking for my own information. I'm keeping track of it so that I can compare how many of the half cadences overall in Bach's writing are Phrygian rather than just regular run-of-the-mill, or I guess non-Phrygian half cadences, because the bass is something that Bach has control over, or at least to my knowledge he has control over it. So whether or not a cadence is a Phrygian half cadence versus a non-Phrygian half cadence is potentially interesting to me. What's kind of interesting about this phrase is that we're going to go from A minor to the key of C major and then right back to the key of A minor at the end. So we have a brief detour back to the relative major and then back to the minor at the end of the phrase, rather than staying in the key of the same minor key that we spent the majority of the phrase we just analyzed in. So we start the phrase off with E major, E, G sharp, E, and B. It's our 5 chord. We then have A major, A, E, and C with a passing tone here in the tenor. Sorry, I forgot the name of it, the name of the voice. And I do think this is where we go to the key of C major. It now becomes our 6th chord, either somewhere on beat 2 or somewhere on beat 1. The reason why I said beat 1 is because beat 2 in triple meter chorales has a tendency to sometimes be a point that sort of separates 2 chords, like it's a passing beat. Bach often oscillates between regular harmonic rhythm on every beat and harmonic rhythm on 1 and 3. Seldom do we get situations where we have harmonic rhythm on 1 and 2. It's usually all 3 beats or beat 1 and beat 3. So this C feels more like an accessory to beat 1 than it does feel like its own chord. Also, only one voice is moving, so all in all, not super important. This is a very minute detail, just justifying based on what I've said in the past, which is I tend to analyze modulations as late as possible, unless there's a reason to analyze them earlier. And this is a case where there's a reason to analyze earlier, even though it's a very slight earlier analysis. But 6 takes us to G, B, G, and D. It's our 5 chord in root position, G major, and then we have C major, C, C, G, and E. Tonic triad, root position, little delayed passing tone here in the melody before we get B, D, G, and G, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, G major over B. And we're looking for a point where we modulate to A minor, and it can be really any of these points. I think we're going to modulate really right up against the cadence here, because it sounds like we're in the key of C major throughout the next 2 chords, even though we land on an A minor chord here. A, C, C, and F. Apologies, that's not an A minor chord, that's F major over A. 5 going to 4, kind of an unusual progression. They are both in first inversion though, so not the most unusual, but seeing 5 and 4 go in that direction, it's much more common if 5 is going to go to a 4 chord that it's ascending, so like 5 to 4, 6. That's much more common than 5, 6 to 4, 6. And if we're going to see 5 go to a predominant chord, it usually goes to 2, based on my experience, having analyzed the chorales as far as I have. But after 4, 6, we have G, E, B, and E, which is E minor over G. And this is the main reason why I didn't say this F major chord was our point in which we modulated, because we went to an E minor chord afterwards, and it is quite possible that this could be a minor dominant in the key of A. I think that's a very valid analysis. I just think it's unlikely based on the precedent that Bach has set for this chorale, and that is we sort of expect the G sharp. If we had been seeing minor dominance up until this point, I think there would be a stronger argument for this to be a point in which we have already modulated, but this E minor chord sounds like it belongs to C major rather than A minor. This happens to be a 3/6 chord, E minor over G. And that takes us to D minor, F, F, A, and D, which is 2/6 in the key of C major. And if I didn't know any better, we would just end the phrase off with C major in maybe first inversion, like a 1/6 chord, because we just have this long adjacent progression here. But I do think that with the E major being this sort of, I say deceptive because it is sort of fools us, because we would expect this D minor chord to maybe turn into or take us to a 5 chord and then take us to 1 in the key of C, but it's sort of used as a pivot to separate an E minor chord from an E major chord, sort of like a longer cross relation between this G natural and this G sharp. But I think what creates this Phrygian half cadence is the D minor with the over the F sharp going to 5. E, B, G sharp, and E. E major in root position are dominant in the key of A minor. And in a very similar fashion to the phrase we just analyzed, we are going to end in another half cadence. This time it's not a Phrygian half cadence, but we're going to move to the key of C major, then back to the key of A minor. Not quite as extreme as this modulation, which is right up against the cadence, or right up against the final cadential chord. It happens during the cadence. Here we have G sharp before the cadence, so the modulation, similar to the reason why the modulation happened here, this is sort of like the telling point for us. But 5 does take us to 1, A, C, A, and E, A minor in root position. And I do think in the same way that we modulated to C earlier, this is now our 6th chord. We then have E, C, G, and E, which is our tonic triad in first inversion, a la the first progression that we saw, but rather than going to 5, we have a neighbor tone in the alto, and then we go to a tonic triad root position, C, C, G, and E. We'll just change the figure bass. Really unusual progression, 6, 1, and then 1 again. We sort of, I guess, what is it? Oh God, how am I forgetting this word? Arpeggiate. We see an A minor arpeggio here in the bass, which is kind of interesting. And that C major is sort of the final objective of this progression. We're already in the key of C major at this point, in my opinion. And we're going to stay in the key of C for the next measure as well. We have G, D, B, and D, which is our 5 chord, root position. Little neighbor tone here in the tenor before we get B, D, G, and D, which is just taking our 5 chord and putting it in first inversion, kind of seeing a mirrored sort of structure here, right, of first inversion going to a root position and a root position going to a first inversion. Not super important, but something that visually sticks out when I'm looking at this. And one of the big takeaways that I try to leave my students with, and just one of the more underlying notes in my videos, is that, you know, if theory is going to teach you anything, regardless of what music you apply it to, being sensitive to patterns like this and using sort of like your critical eye and critical thinking to see little patterns like this makes the music feel more personal to you. And that's the big takeaway, because a lot of the, you know, the Roman numerals and the functions and all sorts of things can be really useful if you are someone who engages with this music regularly. But knowing that there's some structure underneath the hood, and that you can identify patterns like that, is I think the big takeaway, and something that transcends music of the Western, you know, common practice period, or just, I guess, the common practice period in Western art music, Western European art music, that is. But 5, 5, 6, passing tone in the tenor again, and then we go to A, or sorry, not A minor, kind of fooled me there. We have A, and my brain tends to fill in the blanks rather than looking for context immediately. We have F and we have D, and that would make this a D minor chord in second inversion. Very unusual, not a 2-4-3 chord, which is far more common, but a 2-6-4 chord. And this 2-6-4 chord, I think, in the same way that this 2-6 chord is our gateway into the key of A minor, it is now our 4-6-4 chord, and this is what we would typically refer to as a passing 6-4 chord, because the bass is passing. It's a passing tone between B and G sharp, and that G sharp is the base of an E major chord. G sharp, E, B, and E. It's 5-6, and right, oh sorry, I was confused. I'm like, wait, do we have a 5-6 and a 5-6 here? How'd that make sense? No, it's because we were in the key of C major. Sorry, that was just me getting in my own head. We have a passing 7th in the melody here, and then we would expect A minor after this. A, E, A, and C, tonic triad, root position, and then we cadence on E major, E, E, G sharp, and B. Our 5 chord, E major, root position. Moving to the next phrase. Now the next phrase is particularly interesting because of the sound. We have a direct modulation, and if we redacted this C sharp going to D natural here, I would be kind of confused because we have this F natural here along with this F natural here, and it gives a particularly unique sort of E Phrygian sound. But what creates that E Phrygian sound is the fact that we're not, it's the F natural against the E minor, but we're actually, in my opinion, in the key of D minor, which is going to be a gateway back into the key of A minor. So a slight detour, moving to the key of D minor. Let me make the stem of the D a little bit longer. And we start off not with a 2 diminished chord, but a 2 minor chord. So this B turns into melodic minor in terms of D. And on the way out, it turns into A minor with the D becoming the 4 and then C becoming the 3. It looks very A minor-like on the way out. So here we have this prolonged emphasis on E minor, neighboring 7th in the bass, neighbor tone in the alto before we get another E minor chord that's just a 2 chord. And remember, D melodic minor, or just melodic minor in general, a 2 chord, if you harmonize the melodic minor scale, becomes minor rather than diminished, which is what we would typically expect. But afterwards we have some passing tones in the alto and the bass, and that takes us to an interestingly, it's kind of interesting, it's a 4-2 chord, G, A, E, and C sharp. That's A7 over G. We would expect this to resolve to a tonic triad in first inversion, which it does. Bach never disappoints with his 4-2 chords, F, A, D, and D. And when I say never disappoints, that was just a little sarcastic humor. It's not like if he didn't resolve a 4-2 chord properly, it would disappoint anything. It's just pretty much every, if not all of the 4-2 chords have resolved the way that we've been taught they are to resolve, which is the bass resolves down by step, because that's the chordal 7th, and typically the root is a 5th down. So 5 goes to 1, 6 goes to 2, 7 goes to 3, etc. So 1-6 is going to turn into 4-6 in the key of A minor. Then we have E, A, E, and C. Interestingly enough, another passing 6-4 chord. In this case, it's a 1-6-4. So here we have 5 going to 2-6-4, and here we have 4 going to 1-6-4. It's pretty interesting because they're both a fourth apart. It's a descending fourth. And then we have D, G sharp, F natural, and B natural, which is G sharp fully diminished 7th over D. That's 7-4-3. And we would expect this to sort of be like a pattern like we saw earlier, 1-2-1-6. Typically this would be a 7-6 chord. If we take that pattern of one chord being in first inversion and the other chord being in second inversion, we would use a diatonic step below in second inversion to bridge the gap between the two chords. And in this case, it's a 7-7 chord rather than a 7 chord, just the triad. But it's following that exact same pattern that we would have expected this chord to follow, or this progression to follow, rather. I think it's interesting that we're seeing both sides of the progression. The very unusual, or not very unusual, but the less likely version of the progression, and a variation on that same progression using the chords that we'd more likely see. So in this case, we have 1-6, C, A, E, and A. That takes us to D, D, F, and A, which is D minor in root position. That is a 4 chord. We then have E, B, E, and G sharp. That's E major in root position. That's our 5 chord. And that takes us to our perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor, or 1 chord. A, C, E, and A. Alright, last phrase. Kind of an interesting phrase. The cadence, there is some interesting information to unpack here. You might already be ahead of me. This might be the part of the chorale that sort of sticks out. It might be the hallmark of this particular chorale, but we'll get to it when we get to it. We start off like we have in the majority of the phrases, detouring to a different key before exploring a different key at the end. There are lots of what I've been calling mid-phrase modulations, where Bach won't just modulate to a key and then stay in that key. Like in the second phrase, for example, this is not a mid-phrase modulation, but rather, what would be the third phrase is technically it. The fourth phrase is it as well. The fifth phrase also has a mid-phrase modulation where we start in a key and then modulate to a different key. So the phrase is in a key that isn't the same as the previous phrase, and then we see another modulation. And we're going to see that exact same structure in the last phrase as well. This, we start off with movement towards C major, but we start off with a chord progression in A minor. E, E, G sharp, and B is our 5 chord. E major, and we expect that to go to A minor, A, E, A, and C. A minor in root position, and that's going to take, it's going to be recontextualized as our 6th chord. F is an escape tone. I believe that's what it's called, an escape tone, where you step and then skip or leap out of it in the opposite direction. Technical term. It's a non-chord tone regardless. And then 6 we would expect, based on our previous encounter with this progression, we would expect it to go to 5, B, D, G, and D. In this case it's 5, 6, and we would expect that to go to 1, which it does. C, C, G, and E. Tonic triad root position. The interesting thing about this progression is that it, I think we're going to the key of E minor at the end, like I said before, because the melody really feels like it's tonicizing E minor, but if we look at what's happening here in the alto, it leaves us with a bit of a confusing situation. We have F sharp, G sharp, and A, which looks like A melodic minor, but it also looks like E major, and this might be a bout of mode mixture, but also considering we've spent so much time in this chorale referencing A minor, I can't help but associate this melodic minor fragment with A minor. We also cadence on an E major chord, so there's this duality of this sort of feeling like an authentic a half cadence in terms of its commentary or association with the rest of the chorale and how E relates to A, but with the D sharp in the melody as well as the bass movement B, B, E, we're ending on E and we're really tonicizing it. So I do think we're in the key of E minor here, and this is just some mode mixture, some borrowing from the parallel major here. So we have 6 passing tone in the bass, and the cool thing is that we do go to a 2 chord, which is where we would expect to go to, especially in a cadential situation or nearing a cadential situation. A, C, F sharp, and E, so that's F sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is 2, 6, 5. We then have some type of semblance of what I believe to be a B major chord, which is 5, where the melody is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. It's very common for 4-3 suspensions to occur over 5 chords, B, B, F sharp, and E. The resolution happens on the next beat, but what could potentially be happening here is with this G sharp, which I think is happening, it's just a passing tone and creating counterpoint, is that it does leave us with a G sharp minor chord, which would be a 3, 6 chord in the key of E major. So I don't know exactly if that's the chord that's happening here. It does create an unusual cadential situation if that is the case. All in all, I think really this G sharp is more contrapuntal than anything else, but if you're really hearing a different chord on beat 2, it would be borrowing from the parallel major, or the 2 chord and the 6 chord are borrowing from the parallel minor. It really depends on your perspective and where you feel this phrase is oriented, if we're in major or if we're in minor. To me, I think we're in minor and we're borrowing from major, especially because the major chord that we cadence on is, I think, more so a byproduct of the convention of Bach ending minor chorales with a major chord, and also the fact that I feel like Bach is morphing an otherwise A minor-ish chorale to be an E minor at the end, and instead of tonicizing the dominant at the end, we are we've modulated. So this G sharp, I feel like it's just a passing tone, and then on the third beat of the measure, we have B, B, A, and D sharp, which is an incomplete 7 chord. This A is the 7th of the chord, and we have 2 roots and a third, so 7, 3, no 5, just a root position 7 chord, and then we cadence, perfect authentic cadence, in the key of E with a 1 chord, E, B, G sharp, and E. Tonic triad, root position, major chord. Bach often ends his minor chorales with major chords, like I was saying, but that's pretty much today's analysis. All in all, super fascinating. Lots of quirky progressions throughout. I would say the most noteworthy quirky progression is 2 going to 1. We see it twice in this chorale. Admittedly, the 2 used here in place of 7 is a lot less common, or I can't recall a time where we've had this progression. I feel like maybe we have, but it's so uncommon that it's eluding me as to how frequent we've seen it. If it has happened, it's only happened like once or twice over the span of, like, 300, almost 350 chorales now. It's pretty crazy. And other than that, just the mid-phrase modulations and just the unique nature of the mid-phrase modulations. The fact that we typically move to C and then go back to A minor, or the fact that we revisit A minor after spending a sizable portion of the phrase in a different key. So the first, I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's a comment on the form. The first 2 phrases, we have 1 in C, 1 in A minor, and the rest of the phrases spend their time exploring a different key before going to A minor. It's almost like diminishing the length of the, like, kind of like hybridizing the the first 2 phrases key centers, and plugging them in together and seeing them happen in sequence. Regardless, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in today's chorale, and of course the ending is particularly unusual, or it has a unique profile, and whether or not it's unusual, I don't know, but I think, if we were labeling this ending unusual, moving to E minor would not be the first place I would expect. In fact, I think there's some argumentation here, that there's room for debate. I'm fairly certain we're in the key of E at the end here, but we really have no reason to have expected the key of E to be our final destination here at the end of the chorale. But that's pretty much all I have to say about today's episode. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.